Ci scusiamo per questo lieve ritardo nell'inizio di questa
Sorry for this brief delay on the occasion of the final event of the festival. There are some controls underway. There are people outside who are waiting to get in. They will get in gradually, but we cannot further delay the start of this lecture by Professor Daniel McFadden. It's very important because it draws and it touches upon the main issues which have been discussed in these days. Daniel McFadden is an econometric, meaning that he's a scholar who deals with models, abstract models of economics, data, and econometrics requires work on models and modeling, and you certainly had the possibility of listening to presentations about econometrics in these days. The reality is so complex that we have to simplify it. And these models help us draw conclusions. And then we need to test the consequences and implications of these models and see if they have a practical use and see whether these models are then confirmed in reality. But the question is that information is often limited. You have to change models so that you can match models with reality. And there is a continuous dialogue between data and reality. So this job is fundamental for a discipline like economics. With the passing of time, greater amounts of data and information has been made available, and it is possible to examine these data pretty fast today. And the work of the econometric person has become central. And it is very rare today to find a scientific paper which doesn't have an empirical part. In the past, you often had just purely theoretical papers without the tests based on data analysis. So the job of Daniel McFadden is particularly important, and it is a type of job that all of us appreciate and value. Daniel McFadden received the Nobel Prize in 2000 for the models of discrete choices. These are models which match reality with empirical data and which consider situations where there are qualitative choices to make, binary choices, whether to choose A or B, whether to participate in the labor market or not. We spoke a lot in these days about women's jobs and women's participation in the labor market. So here there is a binary choice. Either you have women participating in the labor market or you don't have women participating in the labor market. So the choice should be yes or no. And the fact that choices are distributed in this way entails problems in terms of traditional measurements and analysis of data. And the work of Professor McFadden enabled us to match data with reality and to infer implications from these data. In his career, he received various acknowledgements and prizes. I'll just mention a few. The John McFADDEN Medal in 1975, and then he became Fellow of the Academy of Arts and Sciences in 77, and then in 81 he became a member of the National Academy of Science, and then in 1986 he received the Frisch Medal for the Econometric Society, and in 2000 he received the Memons Prize of Economics of the Northwest University. It's all important prizes and acknowledgements. And then he graduated in physics, and he also was a professor of physics, and then he also dealt with psychology, behavioral sciences. So he has a very wide-ranging set of interests. And if we look at his scientific CV, which is really impressive, we see that he made contributions in very different disciplines. He published articles in the best international journals on production theory, transport, and then, of course, econometrics and theory of econometrics. And then he wrote articles on growth, development, pure economic theory, mathematical theory. And then he wrote about energy, health, and environment as well. So people who have so much flexibility, mental flexibility, are really able to apply models to different disciplines and to different problems and issues. This evening, the title of his presentation is Doing Well for Doing Good, How to Reconcile Private Incentives, Profits, and the Common Good. So this is a central issue in the festival of these days. And in this case, we have to measure incentives, measure performance, and he will tell us about that. I don't want to take away any further time, and I give him straight away the floor. And at the end of his lecture, as usual, we will entertain some questions.
Let me say first that this is my first visit to Trento, and my wife Beverly and I have very much enjoyed the sights and shops and the pedestrian strolling in Trento, a lovely city. Second, I want to apologize. I do not speak Italian. My wife's cousin in Tuscany once said to me, "How can you call yourself a professore when you don't speak Italian?" And it's true. It's been a burden to my career. But please indulge me then. I will speak through a translator. I'm going to pose initially a question, which I think is a provocative one, which is, should politicians be paid for good social and economic performance by the state? Let me be specific. Suppose each member of the Italian Parliament were offered a bonus of 10 million euros if difficult but realistic targets were met by the end of 2015 on growth, unemployment, and the government deficit. Would the possibility of achieving these targets increase substantially in the presence of these incentives? Now, this kind of scheme resembles the compensation packages offered to corporate executives. These packages are intended to align their interests with those of the corporate stockholders. And a question for you is this: is it appropriate to run government like a business and compensate politicians like corporate executives? After all, Many of their tasks are similar, and we would all like them to work hard for our public interest as stockholders of the state. One comment, and that is that Benjamin Franklin, the famous American statesman of the 18th century, said that the key to success, financial and reputation, is to do well by doing good. If you are diligent and industrious in your work, in an appropriate framework, you can do well as a result. Now, what about targets for the Italian economy, and what could you possibly ask of the Italian Parliament? Italy's growth rates have been pretty bad over the last 5 years. There's now a slight improvement. It appears that the economy will grow by about 1.1% next year with current OECD projections. Suppose we ask the Parliament to do what they needed to do to increase that growth rate to 2.1%. So a 1% increase in the Italian growth rate. That's, by the way, would not be out of line with what this economy has achieved in the past, although it would be higher than it's been achieving for most of the last 5 years. If that target were matched, then the Italian economy would have 13.7 billion euro gain in its domestic product compared to the OECD forecast. So then let me come back to the question. Would it be worth it to offer the 315 members of the Italian Parliament 10 million euros each if they are successful in achieving a target of 2.1% growth in 2015 without increasing government debt? Now, if this target were reached, this would mean that you would have $13.7 billion more. Now, some of that would have to be collected as taxes to pay the Parliament. The Parliament in total would receive 3.15 billion euros. But even after that, the public would have an additional 10.5 billion euros in their pockets. They would get 76% of the additional 1% of growth back. Now, your reaction to this is probably that's my reaction, which is this would be an insane and disgusting thing to do, to pay politicians this much, and a lot of people are already quite unhappy with the high compensation to corporate executives, and I understand the sentiments about this, and we'll talk about that. But the first question would be, could Parliament actually do this? If you offered this kind of a strong incentive to the Parliament, is there a possibility they could actually get an additional 1% growth out of the Italian economy? And I think the answer is they probably could. With an unemployment rate of 12.6% and a famously inefficient labor force, Italy has a lot of room to expand its productivity and expand its income. You could use the private sector by incentivizing firms to put people on to work in productive ways, or you could engage in public infrastructure such as expanded education, Wi-Fi, free Wi-Fi throughout the country, so forth. And I believe all these things put together, organized by clever politicians that really work together to accomplish something for the society rather than expending their energy trying to assure their election in the next round, they could accomplish quite a bit that they probably otherwise will not. Now, in this talk, I want to talk about these kinds of economic incentives and compare them with the incentives that politicians currently have, and essentially ask the question whether sharpening incentives, particularly economic incentives, could improve performance. There are a series of topics that I'm going to cover slide by slide. One, the issue of democracy and how we are satisfied we are with it. Second, what are called principal-agent relationships in economic and social settings. And legislators, parliamentarians are our agents operating ostensibly on our behalf. I'll talk about the economic theory of agency and performance-based compensation. And then I will talk a little about corporate experience with these kinds of schemes for giving people incentives to work hard. I'll say a little bit about the analogy between corporate and state governments. They're not the same, and it's certainly not automatically true that what makes good businessmen makes good government managers. But we can talk about what the similarities are. We'll talk about one obvious issue in using these kinds of corporate schemes for government officials, which is who gets to set the price, how could you go about doing that? And finally, I'll just make a few comments about the sociology of performance. If a group has to do a task, what's the best way to incentivize them to do that? Is it to give everyone an incentive? Is it to give the whole group an incentive? Nobody gets it unless everyone succeeds, and so forth. So that's where we'll go with this. Begin with the issue of democracy and discomfort with democracy. Democratic governance is much admired in theory, but it often proves unresponsive and inefficient in practice. It leads to public disdain for politics. The traditional legal and constitutional approach to control of politicians is through approval by an informed and vigilant electorate, and also by judicial enforcement of a code of conduct, which is supposed to control corruption. In practice, approval or rejection at the ballot box is a blunt tool for regulating political behavior. Voters are often poorly informed, manipulable, and capricious, and politicians don't necessarily get reelected by performing for the public good. Second, judicial checks to control corruption are somewhat even and quite slow. So one comment before I go on, I'm going to talk about how to make government more efficient, but one point about democracy is that one of the features of democracy is it distributes power in such a way that it's very hard for any single individual to accumulate power and perhaps abuse it. And to some extent, the inefficiency and petty corruption that occurs in democracy is the price we pay for protection against abuse of power. So always keep in mind, as we talk about how to make things more efficient, we want to be careful not to lose one of the great advantages of democracy, which is to keep us free from abuse of power. One question is, do traditional ways of approving and compensating politicians make democracy less efficient than it needs to be? And I think the answer is yes. The way we fund political campaigns through parties and sponsors who have special interests tends to focus the loyalty of politicians to their base rather than to the broader public. The salaries that politicians receive, it's true in the U.S., I think it's true here as well, are relatively low compared to what many of these politicians could earn in the private sector, and they do not have ties to performance. So being a more effective legislator doesn't get you a higher salary. As a result, the politicians tend to be individuals who are more willing to seek their rewards through special dealing while in office and through connections that they have after they leave office. And it may discourage more constrained individuals from going into politics. Now, it should be in the public's interest to pay for and get politicians who are skilled and diligent in working on the public's behalf. So the question of how politicians are paid should, in the end, be an economic question. Are we paying enough, and are we paying it in the right way to get the kind of performance from politicians that would benefit us all? One general comment: many politicians are dedicated public servants, but it's a mistake to think that dedication is enough. Moral fiber is strongest when not cut by self-interest. Now, there are other arrangements than economic incentives that might improve governance. I will mention a few. I'll pose them as questions because these are not recommendations, they're just questions. And there's a tension between these and between these and the fundamental idea of democracy, that it's every one person, one vote. These tend to be elitist, and one of the issues in any kind of schemes to improve the efficiency of the democratic process will often create a tension between the ability, perhaps the ability of the elite to be more discriminating in their politicians and their own special interests, which may give them an unfair advantage. So what could you do? You could require a more informed electorate. You could license only voters who are literate on the candidates and issues in election. You could require attendance of voters at debates and discussions before they vote. You could allow internet voting on detailed issues, so instead of, or in addition to broad votes for candidates and parties, people could express specific opinions on specific kinds of public projects and initiatives. Second, you could require more qualified candidates. You could make a degree in public management a prerequisite for office. You could require new parliamentarians to train and work together experimentally before they go to work for the public. You could provide external audits and information on performance, sort of like movie reviews of political performers. You could also reform campaigning and campaign finance so that politicians are less concerned about the base from which they can get finance their campaigns. Finally, you could change what politicians do. Currently, politicians have to get elected. They have to be executives who decide on broad policy, and to a substantial extent, they have to be managers that are making decisions on day-to-day projects, what to do and who's going to do them and so forth. It's possible that some of those last more technical jobs should be handed off to professional managers, and one way to do that is to train cadres of highly qualified professional managers, make them the operating officers, and leave the politicians in the executive officer position. Now, I'm going to talk about principal-agent relationships in economics and social settings and apply those to government. Many human interactions, economic and social, involve a first party or principal engaged in arranging for a second party or an agent to act on their behalf. Such agency arrangements are common when the agent has some specialized information or skills or time, and thus has a comparative advantage in undertaking certain kinds of tasks. Virtually all commercial transactions have some elements of agency, with each side in a transaction having some comparative advantage of special knowledge. Here are examples of agency relationships. The principal may be a landowner and the agent be a sharecropper in agriculture, a very traditional arrangement. The principal may be an employer and the agent an employee, the principal a patient, the agent a physician, an insurer and the people they insure, a child and a parent, who is an agent trying to work on behalf of the child, a homeowner and the repairman, the plumber, a corporate shareholder and a corporate executive who's working for the shareholders, and finally politicians who are working for the voters. Those are all examples of agency relationships. Now, there's some key features of agency. There may be one or more principals, not necessarily all agreeing, and there may be one or more agents, again, not necessarily all agreeing with each other. Contracts between principals and agents may be informal or formal. Principals and agents often differ in their objectives, attitudes towards risk, and time preference. So one of the issues in how agents are compensated is going to be to balance those conflicts. There are generally asymmetries in skills and information and in costs of monitoring and auditing, and these mean that contracts between principals and agents must rely on common information and usually cannot perfectly align the interests of the parties. Now, there's an additional feature, and that is matches between principals and agents happen in markets that determine the qualifications and participation thresholds of the parties. For example, politicians compete in an election. That's a kind of a market. And the compensation they face is one of the things which determines whether someone enters that market or not. There are two major issues in agency. They're called moral hazard and adverse selection. When an agent has information that the principal does not, such as level or productivity of the agent's effort, there's a risk of what's called moral hazard, where the agent undertakes actions that are in the agent's interest, but contrary to the principal's interest, such as careless or unnecessary work. Secondly, when principals cannot observe all the qualifications of agents, the market may unravel with more qualified agents unable to signal that they're better and worth more than the less qualified agents. This is called adverse selection. By the way, these are very old ideas. Some of the ideas predate economics as a subject by a millennia or two. The first recorded commentary on adverse selection was in the Aristophanes comedy The Frogs in 405 BC, which jokes about bad politicians driving good politicians out of the market for governance in Athens. And that adverse selection became an economics Gresham's law, which is that bad money that you can't tell from good money will tend to drive good money out of the market. Now, performance-based contracting. Historically, principal-agent contracts contain incentives for the agent to avoid moral hazards and to work diligently on behalf of the principal. One of the original forms of agency was sharecropping, and that's an arrangement between a landlord and a tenant. The landlord provides the land and the seeds, and the tenant provides the labor. The crop is shared between them, and the sharing arrangement creates an incentive for the tenant to work hard to succeed in getting a good crop. Now, economic performance and compensation are a form of basic agency theory, but incentives other than current compensation, such as deferred incentives, are important in practice, particularly for agency relationships that extend over time. Also, if risk preferences of the parties differ, then risk sharing as well as incentives that suppress moral hazard are important elements in a contract. One question which will come up generally in agency, is certainly an issue in executive compensation, and I think if you propose it for politicians, it would be an issue there, is will agents get paid more under performance-based contracts than they would otherwise? And I think the answer is simply, first of all, there's no particular reason that people would get paid more under a performance-based contract than they would under a flat payment. But there are two things which would tend to make that not quite true. The first is that if there's a trade-off between a guaranteed salary and a bonus, then you pay people more overall, you may attract better people who can perform better, and they'll get paid more as a result. So that the presence of a performance-based contract may cost you more because you get more for your money. Secondly, if agents are risk-averse, then giving them a contract which requires them to take risks, they don't get the payment unless they can accomplish particular targets, then you have to compensate them for assuming that risk. So that will be an additional cost for the risk management. If performance-based contracts are successful, then both the principal and the agent receive more than they would otherwise. That's the whole point of that kind of contracting. Now, is performance-based compensation of politicians a remedy for self-dealing and corruption? Now, first of all, higher base salaries and performance incentives may make a political career attractive to people who are reluctant to engage in self-dealing and corruption. So that may actually improve that aspect of politicians' behavior. But by and large, incentives to do good doesn't mean that on the side you can't also do some bad, and maybe those two things don't necessarily interfere with each other. Containing corruption that interferes with economic and social progress is important, but it's possible that too much emphasis on eliminating petty corruption rather than on promoting the public interest would actually interfere with effective governance. I'll give you a couple of quotes from American politicians, self-interested ones. There was a political boss named Hurley who said corruption is the lubricant of politics. Another political operator, Jesse Unruh, said money is the mother's milk of politics. And there is the Chinese solution to corruption, partly successful actually, which is keep the rate of growth of corruption below the rate of growth of the economy. So that it's too difficult to get rid of corruption, but hopefully you can keep ahead of it. Now, what shape of performance-based compensation is more effective? Here are some examples of different kinds of schedules in which you are relating the pay that you give to an executive or to a prime minister, say, as a function of some measure of output, such as the growth rate of the economy. One possibility is a linear scheme. That's the second figure here. But there are others. The one that I started with would be like the third figure, a lump sum payment which is made only if a specific target is reached. Now, these kinds of threshold bonuses can be quite effective if they're realistic, but the problem is that if they become unrealistic, then they lose their effectiveness as incentives. And often schemes like the last of these will often be the most effective. Now, I'm going to not spend time on technical slides, but effectively, if you offer an agent a particular incentive schedule, and the left-hand diagram in this slide is a straight line incentive schedule, the higher the output, the more the agent is paid, and the agent dislikes putting in a lot of effort, but certainly likes to have the income, and would pick out an effort level which would maximize the agent's utility given that schedule. Now, if you change the schedule, you would change the point of utility maximization and change the level of effort. Then what the principal would like to do is vary the schedule, in this case, say by varying the share of the extra output that goes to the agent in such a way that the payoff to the principal is maximized. Generally, what will happen is if the agent is not adverse to risk, then the optimal contract is always essentially to have the agent bear all the risk. So that would mean that you, in the case of a parliamentarian would pay a great deal of money to enter the parliament, but then would have the opportunity, if they could keep the economy growing very vigorously, to get that back and a great deal more. But if the agents are risk adverse, which most people are, and have limited ability to absorb losses, then you'll have some sharing arrangement like a agricultural sharecropping arrangement. Now, what's the corporate experience with performance-based compensation? It's an intensely controversial subject. We see in the U.S. and I think in other places a rapid rise in the compensation of managers relative to workers, and that creates a lot of dissatisfaction. It contributes to income inequality, which is a drag on economies both socially and economically. And there are two major complaints about corporate executive compensation. One is that the incentives are often poorly designed and ineffective. We'll see whether that's true, but I would say that in part this comment is correct. The executives are often too short-sighted, and that's because of the way the incentives are designed, and they have an incentive to some extent to manipulate the company books, and that's also a problem. Second complaint, executives earn rents by capturing and manipulating boards of directors, distorting contract incentives and performance measures, and that's a serious problem with executive compensation. I think it leads in many cases to excessive compensation, and if you think about applying it to politics, there is a question of how in the world would you control this when the politicians would tend to have the ability to take over. But before we address any more of that, let me ask the question, is it in fact true that performance-based pay improves firm performance in the corporate setting? By the way, here's a slide. This is taken from a paper by Ben Lorica in 2006. Median CEO compensation by country. I don't know if you can see these figures, but these numbers are quite high, and Italy, surprisingly, is second only to the U.S. in the level at which it compensates its corporate executives. How do companies do if they pay or they provide very high performance incentives to their executives? Here's just a little example. 10 major U.S. corporations drawn at random, and this shows their return on investment as a percent on the vertical axis, and their compensation, and this is the part of the compensation that they wouldn't get unless, or that's associated with achieving a high return. And what you see is that there is a positive relationship. It's rather noisy. And so our first question is, does that kind of diagram indicate a causal path from increased pay to higher return on investment? Is it true that if you give these executives incentives to increase the return on investment, that they can actually do it? They actually do it. Now, the trend line by itself doesn't rule out the possibility that some of this is spurious, that random variations in the fortunes of the firm could both increase pay and return on investment without the executive necessarily being responsible for it. That's an issue. There are several issues in understanding the relationship between performance-based pay schemes and their payoff. One is that there's heterogeneity in how effective the targets are. And second, there's heterogeneity in the circumstances of firms. Some executives have stationary firms that are in cruise control. Some are salvaging firms that have been in trouble and so forth. And if you combine those all together, you don't necessarily get a good picture of how well those executives are doing. But there is a very substantial literature in economics on executive compensation, and this literature, by and large, does a careful job of eliminating some of the spurious effects and identifying what the real impact of executive performance pay is. And the finding is that in terms of realized return or firm growth, there is a strong and positive relationship between managerial pay and the performance of the firm. As you give a higher performance pay incentives, and the executives will tend to do better for the firms. A few other comments from this literature: outside directors in a corporation improve the tuning of performance pay contracts and are more effective in getting rid of underperforming managers. Equity-based compensation seems to do better than bonuses. Ratchet standards, where your compensation is based on doing better than last year, tend to blow up. They tend to be counterproductive. And finally, in one study of Italian compensation, it compares family-controlled firms and non-family controlled firms. In family-controlled firms in Italy, executive compensation is higher, but performance is no better. So there's a case where rents are being taken. Now, what about applying any of this to government? I mean, there are issues in even using it for corporations, but now the question is, what about using it for government officials? There certainly are issues. One, while the interests of stockholders are at least roughly aligned and focused on maximizing expected discounted cash flow, the general public is heterogeneous in its preferences, and not only for the outcomes of state governments, but also for the ideals and form of governance. What's true is that a parliament is the analog of a board of directors, and there's no obvious mechanism under which a disinterested body could establish and monitor compensation for politicians in Parliament. Now, incentivizing agents to work together in a legislative body involves group incentives and social dynamics that are not covered in the standard theory of agency. There are two areas of economics that have to say something about this. One is the theory of public goods provision, which gives some idea of how you might determine how to compensate politicians. And finally, behavioral economics may show some of the effects of social interaction on the effectiveness of various performance schemes. So question one, who sets the price when you have multiple objective principles? One possibility is using what I call economic juries. I'll describe this in some sequence. Suppose people disagree on the priorities that should be given to public projects and actions, including performance benchmarks and incentives given to politicians to induce effective governance. Is there any way to elicit honest valuations and combine them to make social judgments? And the answer is yes, in principle. But most of these schemes are theoretical schemes of economists that do not have a lot of practical experience. I'm going to describe one first. This slide is difficult to read, but I'm just going to describe it in words. It's a method called Dubin's method. And the idea is you have K projects. The projects might be alternative incentive shares for the politicians, for example. Then the state must choose exactly one. So then you ask each voter to write down a euro value, our willingness to pay for each of the alternatives that are available under the following rules. What they write down can be either positive or negative for any given project, but their sum over all the projects has to be non-negative. That is to say, that in total, their willingness to pay for at least one of these projects has to be summed up, has to be greater than or equal to 0. If you then array all of the people in a big array in columns, and you put all the projects in rows, you have an array in which all of the column sums are non-negative. An implication of that is that at least one row sum has to be non-negative. That means that for at least one project, there's a way for all the people who have negative willingness to pay for that project can be compensated by the ones that have positive willingness to pay. There is a way to redistribute people's stated values in such a way that everyone should be satisfied with that outcome. So that is a possible way of making a social decision. Now, that particular scheme does not have a property that economists call incentive compatibility. It's possible that you would try to game that voting system by, if you think there's one of the projects is sure to win, and you actually think it's a very good project, you might actually give it a negative vote because you think it's going to win anyway, and you get paid a little bit as a result. So that's a strategic manipulation, and if you have too much of that going on, it will overturn this and it will not work right. But there are other schemes that are actually more effective in controlling these problems of manipulation. Let me define, first of all, what's called an economic jury. A jury is a body of experts that's utilized to reach some kind of evaluation, finding, or verdict. Examples are committees used to judge wines, juries and panel to determine remedies in civil litigation. Elected legislatures would be an example of an economic jury, and subjects in surveys or experiments who are asked to rank or value public projects, such as an anti-smoking campaign, would be an example of an economic jury. Now, the design of mechanisms to ensure representative recruitment and accurate reporting of values by jurors is a principal agent problem. Now, you could ask an economic jury to evaluate and judge an economic matter and choose among public projects. And the question then is how can you give the jurors incentives so that their interests are aligned with those of the general public, or at least are aligned in such a way that they will be truthful in their evaluations. So here's how an economic jury would work. You would randomly select a jury with, say, capital J members from a population of voters. The question of the jurors, then the value they place on a public project, each individual giving his or her own value. You'd use an incentive-compatible mechanism. I'll explain what that means. And they're asked to give an honest value for what they think a project is worth. And the question is, how does this actually work? First of all, what's an incentive-compatible mechanism? It's an elicitation method in which, under reasonable expectations and behavior, each juror has a self-interest in responding honestly. So that's an incentive-compatible mechanism, and various mechanisms can be more or less incentive-compatible. It's actually impossible to design one that's perfectly incentive-compatible, but at least in jurors that are isolated from each other, you can do pretty well. I'll mention two, and I'm actually going to, in the interest of time, simply just tell you what these are without going through them. One is a mechanism called the Becker Degroot mechanism, and it's essentially a voting mechanism in which people write down the value at which they would vote for this project or not. And it turns out that under some reasonable conditions, that actually, in a jury of reasonable size, will give people incentives to be to give accurate responses, because if they're pivotal in the sense that they could make a difference in the vote, and in a relatively small jury, many people are often pivotal, then they actually will personally suffer from giving an incorrect response. It turns out that under this mechanism, it's a strongly dominant strategy for each person to be honest in their response. A second mechanism, and actually a more famous one, is called the Clark-Groves mechanism. In the form I will use it, it's modified by Jerry Green and by Jean-Jacques Lafont, so the CGGL mechanism. And the idea here is you pick a jury, and effectively you tell each juror you will get a payment which depends on the net benefit that all the other jurors other than yourself see, and now you get to tell us your willingness to pay for this. And it turns out with considerable technical analysis that once again, you can't, as an individual juror, you cannot gain by misrepresenting your value. So this is what's called a provision point mechanism. And there's a slide I'm definitely going to go over quickly. You can demonstrate that in that kind of mechanism, no one has a positive incentive to cheat and give a false answer. So conclusions on economic juries. A relatively small economic jury is adequate to determine with very small cost of error whether projects are desirable for the public. And there are actually two reasons why a relatively small economic juries will do a good job. One is that under very general conditions, you get a very rapid statistical convergence, so that you think, well, it's a sample. It's sort of 1 over J sampling, where there are J jurors. Is actually you get better convergence than that statistically. Second, you can think of the problem in this way. If it's very, very clear that a project is worth doing or not worth doing, you can find that out very quickly with very few people, by asking very few people about it. It's only in the case that the project is just at the margin, where it's really hard to determine whether it's desirable or not, that you would need a lot of people to actually make the choice. So the implication is no reason to use a big jury, because a small jury is going to be able to decide the easy projects, and with the hard projects, it's not going to matter too much. The mistakes you make are not going to be so serious in any case. One example, this is related to my own research. I've done an example in which I consider a project that has a cost of 20 million euros in a city of 240,000 voters. It's a little bit larger than Trento, a little smaller than Trentino. How many jurors do you need to make a very low error decision about whether certain projects should take place in the province of Trentino, such as putting in Wi-Fi throughout the system, or having bicycle stands on every corner? And the answer is if a jury of 125 people will do this with a very high degree of accuracy, less than 0.2% possible cost of errors. So the implication is that you can actually use the public. Instead of requiring everything to go through politicians, one way to get better governance is to ask politicians to do more of the executive tasks and actually go back to the public, to economic jurors and to technicians to do more of the operations and technical tasks. One final comment. What about when you are trying to compensate politicians as groups, a parliament, as opposed to individuals? What can economics tell you about that? Well, there's one little economic game, very simple game, that economists have studied in some depth, And that gives some very interesting implications for how people behave in society as opposed to behaving according to very traditional individualistic economic rationality rules. Here's the way the ultimatum game works. There are two players, generally strangers, and they're offered a reward if the first player can make an offer of some division to the second player, which the second player then accepts. And if the second player accepts, then they each get the reward in that division. And if the second player says no, they neither get anything. Now, that's a game where rationality says the second player has nothing to lose if he's offered any positive amount. So he should always say yes to any positive amount. And if the second player is going to do that, then the first player might as well offer the smallest positive amount. That's not the way people play. The way people actually play in many cultures is that the first player will offer about 40%, and that will usually be accepted. And if the first player offers less than about 20%, that will often be rejected. That's sometimes called altruistic punishment. So what are the implications for politics? The implications are that you may be able to use performance incentives in a way in which you're essentially playing a version of the ultimatum game. In your parliament, you give the first player, I guess the prime minister, a very, very large reward if the parliament is successful in serving the public interest, and then then there's essentially ultimatum play in which each parliamentarian would accept or reject the distribution that's offered by the prime minister. Now, what could you say about such a scheme? First of all, in many traditional democratic organizations, such operations are often denigrated as buying votes, and they're often even illegal. But if you're trying to design economic incentives to optimize the outcomes of governance for the public, such operations should be considered legitimate forms of contracting to improve performance. A comment, social pressure from performance pay to groups can be intense, and incentive schemes that reward information sharing and collaboration are often more effective than those that isolate pivotal groups. Finally, this is an area of economics that has not been much explored, that is to playing ultimatum games within groups, and for possible political applications it would be interesting as a research topic. Conclusion. The control of political behavior in the interest of the public is a principal agent problem. Economists have found that in agency problems, carefully designed performance-based compensation schemes can substantially increase payoffs for principals. The most experience with performance-based compensation is for corporate executives, where these schemes are controversial and widely criticized and often seem to allow excess rents to executives, but nevertheless contribute to shareholder value. There are issues in applying corporate governance models to the state. Nevertheless, it can be argued that we get what we pay for in our compensation of politicians, and it's worth considering using some of the tools of agency theory to create economic and social incentives for politicians to work more diligently for the benefit of the public, to do well by doing good. Thank you.
Come vi dicevo all'inizio, I temi.
As I told you in the beginning, the topics that were covered by Daniel McFadden arranged through many things that were discussed at the festival, and I refer to the alignment, for instance, between governance schemes and compensation and corporate situations. We have listened to many theoretical observations, but there is a direct repercussion of all this in reality. Actually, we have received many important practical inputs today. In Italy, there was no mention about schemes to change the compensation of Italian members of parliament. Our members of parliament are very well paid. Rather, the opposite is asked to reduce their compensation. And when attempts were made to link the performance of MPs to something, actually the proposal was made to work on the inputs, that is, for instance, to pay them more if they are physically present in Parliament and if they vote there. And no mention was made of the outputs of their work. But much has been debated, actually, also in Italy about using private corporation schemes for public administrators. And we have discussed about this in the framework of the festival as well. By the way, yesterday, a bill was mentioned by Prime Minister Renzi. He said that soon there is going to be one bill and one law decree about this, about the fact that in public administration there will be schemes similar to corporations, and that could even be extended to linking the income of state employees to the GDP. So this is something which is absolutely in line with the things that were said by Professor McFadden. Personally, I do not think that state employees can have an impact on the GDP growth in Italy. Why should give money to people based on that? I don't think that the GDP is dependent on the work of the civil servants. Anyway, let's now take a couple of questions, 2-3 questions, not more than that, because then we have to also to draw conclusions of the overall festival. But now the floor is open to questions. Down there is one person asking for the floor. There, thank you. Good evening. Can you hear me? First of all, I would like to thank wholeheartedly the organizers of the festival and the speaker, of course, for his contribution. Thank you for this lecture. I would also like to tell you a bit about my life, you see, because I'm 86 years old and I've worked a lot in the volunteer sector, in an organization for organ donors, and then the Red Cross, and then blood donors associations. So it is correct to speak about economics, obviously, but we should also talk about the relationship between children and parents and young people and the elderly. Thank you, but we did so. We had a whole festival on intergenerational relations. I would like to have questions on the lecture. Well, of course, it is important to speak about economics, but you should also talk about the family, because families are key. Thank you. Thank you. We understood. And labor, because you see, labor has changed so much. In the past, we worked in the countryside, and at the end of the day, we went back home, and we were fine and would have time to spend with our family. Things now are not like that anymore. Thank you so much for your contribution. We have another person asking for the floor here. I don't know whether there are other people who wish to take the floor.
Your lesson. It seems that you take for granted that the outcome of all these games and strategies are actually measurable. But in fact, as you said, there's an information asymmetry between principal and agent. So how can you deal with these problems? So how are these performance actually measurable, since the people that actually talk to the public about those outcomes may modify information according to their interest?
You want to answer immediately?
The question you pose is a critical one, actually, and I think that it's speculation as to how it would work in politics, but I think we already see in the corporate sector that there are serious issues in what you measure and what the targets for an executive would be. And I don't have a simple answer. I think that right now many corporate compensation schemes do rather poorly in terms of the long run benefit of the corporations. And I think that if you try to apply these performance schemes to politicians, you're going to have many of the same problems. But I still think that we should think about it. I think we should think about what kind of incentives politicians have now, and to what extent the incentives they have now distort their behavior so that it does not work in our public interest. And simply ask the question, could we modify it in any way that would make it better? The corporate model is one possible model, but I think it would be very good for economists, public economists, to think seriously about schemes somewhere in the whole spectrum of possibilities.
Abbiamo una domanda qui.
There is one question here. I see no other raised hands. Well, yes, there is one person there. Up there. Please stand up so that we can see you. Good evening, Professor Boeri. Good evening, Professor McFadden. It is very interesting to apply the game theory to the possibility of a better governance, but I think that it is not practically possible in terms of having, for instance, compensation for people judging the programs of politicians. I don't think that it would be democratic. Applying money to politics, this is what I mean, I think it's not democratic, actually. And that is one reason. An additional reason is that it is difficult for people then to pass an independent judgment about programs because they are influenced by political parties, and political parties establish beforehand, a priori, what should be important, and they tell people what should be important for them.
I agree with the difficulties. What I would say just is that it's true that you would like, and ideally, have a political system that is not driven by money. But even without considering new performance-based compensation schemes, we have politicians that are influenced by money. Money is one of the factors that enters, and it enters in a way which I think works to the public's disadvantage when it mostly comes from special interests. And I think that we need to think seriously about how to replace money, special interest money, with money that would be directed to the politicians if they perform for the benefit of the whole.
C'è una domanda qua su, magari...
There is a question up there. I don't know how you can get the microphone. Shall we try? Interpreters cannot hear unless the question is asked in a microphone. Interpreters do not hear unless the question is asked in the microphone. If it is in English, we can't translate that into Italian.
We may have schemed over is maybe the fact that these incentive schemes are geared toward very simple, straightforward targets. But the question is, maybe political action, political choices are concerned with very long-term and complex issues, and that's what we ask politicians to do. So how can we actually apply schemes to very complex decisions? So say we talked about increasing GDP by 1%, but the question is, what if the point is maybe not today raising GDP, but restructuring the economy so that tomorrow we get a higher rate of growth, which require the opposite, actually. This would be the question.
Grazie.
Thank you.
There's any incentive scheme that's based on output has the possibility that you will compensate your manager, your agent, not because of the effort they put out, but because of chance. But that's because in the nature of this relationship, chance is going to enter the output determination. I think that if you want to use these schemes to induce more careful management, then one of the prices is that sometimes the executives will get money for that's not really justified by their own individual effort. Now, you raised the question of whether there are clear targets that would be in the public interest, and I would say it's true. It's governance is a complicated business, and it needs to be flexible. But looking, say, at the Italian economy, I would say that if the parliament had a target which said that a great deal of their money would be taken away if the government deficit went outside target ranges, or if unemployment went above target ranges, for example, I believe that would focus their attention and perhaps replace some of the inter-party squabbling with an effort to try to make sure that they don't all get a great deal of income loss from poor performance.
Ancora una domanda?
We take another question.
You can create the incentives for all of the politicians and to align them, but if they still need to be reelected in order to make that pay incentive in the next period, and it's very expensive to be elected in terms of raising a lot of money, isn't there still a tremendous distortion in the system? And secondly, don't the special interests go bribe the juries or the rulemakers who make the incentives for the politicians, and the game just is carried on a different frontier?
Well, unfortunately, I'm afraid you're right about the second. It's very nice to think about these things theoretically. It's of course very challenging to make them, insulate them in practice from the people who are very skilled at manipulating schemes like this.
Bene, credo che siamo tornati alla prima lezione di Eric Maskin.
Yeah, I think we have gone back to the comments made also in the first presentation by Professor Maskin at the beginning. Now you know that all the presentations of the festival are in the website. I'm saying that also to all those who are watching us online. Now, this is the last conference of this festival. Just a couple of words to draw some conclusions to strike a balance of these days. Well, I can tell you that data on participation are satisfactory. You yourselves have seen how many people participated in the festival. There are figures on visitors to the website, which are extraordinary indeed, and which will be published in the next few days. And then quality is important. Yesterday, we asked the people who were in the hall of Santa Chiara before the meeting with Prime Minister Renzi, we asked them how many students were there. Well, 3 people out of 4 were students. So we appreciate, we're very happy about such a large share of students. This morning there was the prize ceremony of students, and they spoke about their experience in the festival, and it was very nice. And then the public went to many debates, also the most difficult ones, the most technical ones, the most abstract ones. I have to say that also the questions made during conferences are indicative. Yesterday, for example, there were questions to the Prime Minister. Unfortunately, he could answer only 3 of those questions, but he took notes of those questions, and slowly he will answer those questions, and he will publish them in the website of the government. And then a second reason for satisfaction has to do with the impact. Now, judging based on the coverage, the media coverage of the festival. Well, today, for example, we had a large coverage in Germany, in the German media. We have many journals, many newspapers participating. But then there are other indicators which perhaps are less direct to measure the impact. And the impact is measured by the presence of so many people here. And the public certainly represents a new ruling class. Many of the people who have been here in these days are people who work, are people for whom time is money. And we've had managers, executives who accepted to stay longer than expected. So they came, they delivered their speech, but then they stayed longer. And this is a measure of the interest. And then in terms of content, we had a lot of suggestions. Of course, we cannot expect a festival to produce definitive answers. But I think that some food for thought was presented in terms of women in the ruling classes, and also in terms of the elections legislation. Some suggestions were made, and then university contests and competitions. So I think that many ideas which were discussed during this festival will be useful contributions to the national debate. Now, there are various reasons for satisfaction. And then, also with reference to Professor McFadden, the slides, the texts will remain in the archive of the site of the festival. So you can go to the site and visit all the various sections. Now, I'd like to invite here to the stage all the people who have made this festival possible, starting from the president of the provincial government, Rossi, the dean of university, the rector of university, Mrs. De Pretis, and then the scientific committee with its president, Cipolletta, Giuseppe Laterza, and Paolo Collini. And then many other people who have worked hard to make this event wonderful. We cannot invite them all on the stage. There are many people who have made an extraordinary work and job. And as a representative, I'd like to invite Marilena De Francesco.
Bene, tocca a me? Tocca a me?
Sì.
Sei sicuro?
Tocca a te.
Tocca a me. Bene, buonasera.
Good evening. I'd like to start by expressing some thanks. Tito Boeri, our university. Giuseppe Laterza, and Marilena De Francesco, who has taken on the responsibility of this work. I'd like to thank the public, the audience, the people who have participated in the festival. I'd like to thank Professor McFadden, and by thanking him, I thank all the speakers who have honored us. And hopefully we will draw some useful conclusions and implications also in Trentino in relation to the compensation of policymakers. This is a very hot topic. I appreciated, I liked very much the prize awarding ceremony this morning. And there was a young lady, a young woman this morning who said, I thank you because in this festival I heard things that normally I do not hear. Well, I don't know if we can call it a success, but certainly I breathed an air of success, an air of attention. We tried to improve the spin-off also in relation to the German-speaking community and German-speaking world. I think that never as this year, the festival has been able to combine the contents of the presentations with the ability to provide opportunities for discussion and debate. Now, we've just had the European elections and the electoral campaign. Let me say that has not really been able to go in depth into the topics, while the festival has been very useful, in my opinion. And I'd like to think that many of the youths participating in this festival can draw some useful conclusions and will be perhaps spurred and encouraged to become the ruling classes of the future for the common good, of course. This is our hope for the future. Thank you, and see you next year.